For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini, ANC struggle icon and former IEC chair Dr. Brigalia Bam joins me to discuss her Ubuntu Lifetime Achievement in Diplomacy Award. So Dr. Bam, you call yourself an ancestor. For those who might not remember your work, can you briefly tell us who is Dr. Brigalia Bam?
Long story, like all ancestors. It means ancestors are people who have been living for very, very old. I was born 86 years ago in what was called the Transkei Eastern Cape. I grew up there, which was wonderful, and I had an opportunity in my life already then to work in KwaZulu-Natal as a teacher and as a social worker. And I was also very fortunate to be in a family that was very supportive, with wonderful siblings, a very caring mother who took care of us when my father passed on quite early. And those days things were very difficult because we had to be sent to boarding schools. And so I live all the time with appreciation very much of my mother, all the efforts to really not only bring me up, but also many values from her of sharing and caring and loving. And then I had an opportunity while I was working for this wonderful organization called Young Women Christian Association, started many years ago in England. And this organization is the one that really opened doors for me, because the first advantage and wonderful experience of working with YWCA is that where I was groomed by women, where I was nurtured by women, where I learned to organize, making many mistakes. I learned to lead, making mistakes and learning. And I also learned to love and appreciate women, because it was the first time that I work day and night. All my bosses, the members of the board, the members of the committee, I go to women's clubs in townships those days, in Umlazi, in Guamashu, in Lamontville, and then I go on to the rural part of Natal. And there I was greatly nurtured, and that is where, in fact, I think the potential was discovered by an organization overseas called World Council of Churches, which is based in Switzerland. And that's where I was finally lucky to go after struggles of getting passports, and worked there for many, many years. I joined the African National Congress with very little understanding of what it was. I think that is always, I emphasize to people. It was in 1952, and I was then a student in the Eastern Cape at an institution called Lovedale. The Lovedale Institution was one of the old Presbyterian schools, and where we were trained. And this particular school was very near Fort Hare University. And then it was the time when the African National Congress had decided that they were going to go into big protests of entering buildings that we couldn't enter as South Africans, like cafeteria, train stations. We couldn't go to banks those days, you know, we had special lines for banks. Everything, as you know, was divided. Even if you are sitting in an ordinary stool, if you enter into a cafeteria, things were served to us through the windows. So I belong to that generation. And so as students, we decided to organize ourselves also and participate in that. And so I was very active in the girls' school, organizing other girls that on the day we are closing the schools, we mustn't go and board the train. Can you imagine? And I thought that was a great action. I was so scared, so nervous. We mustn't board the train. We must refuse, and we must just sit on the side of the white people. And we thought that would be the greatest protest. Lo and behold, we were told by the leader, at that time, Dr. Njongwe, of the ANC, that he didn't want students to participate in, and because we didn't even know what was going on. And that was the beginning, really, of my understanding. Then in Natal, I was very fortunate that when I worked in Natal and lived in Durban, one of my first friends, by sheer chance, was Dr. Ntombazana Luthuli, the daughter of Luthuli. I didn't know that, who she was. We met as young women. We happened to be the same age. And then I started to go to her home. And then suddenly, so Ntombazana has this wonderful, famous father, Dr. Luthuli. And so the influence of just being around that family and around many people at that time in Natal. Now, this was the late 50s, 1956, 57. And we did a lot of work, which was very different from the work done now. I worked at that time for the Young Women Christian Association, and I used to use the car of the office at night to carry papers of the ANC, which was frightening and underground. And I used to be so scared, and I'd never project myself as brave. And then I used to be asked to drive people to the border at night, people escaping, going to Swaziland. And I remember those nights of being frightened and praying all the way that I'm not caught on the way, because there were not many women at that time who were driving cars. I got my license in 1960, excited about my work, not really thinking that I would find myself. So those were the early days, and then we lived in backyards. I had a backyard room, one room, as a social worker, later joined by a colleague of mine who was a social worker. And the ANC people, many now, some have since passed on, a very active club, they would come, we would all be in this one room, maybe 8 of us, and then we lock the door and they're hiding from the police. So the kind of work we're doing wasn't sophisticated at all, but very dangerous work at the time.
So congratulations on your Lifetime Achievement in Diplomacy Award, which you received from President Cyril Ramaphosa. What does the award mean to you?
This award means many things to me. The first thing it means is that there are people who still show appreciation to those of us. I think it's important to say I represent others too. The award is for me, which is wonderful, but all my life I have always worked with other people. And so I represent a bigger group. And I need to say I'm glad that those of us who have been working in this country, the privileged people who were part of the past and participated in the struggle in many forms. Many forms. There were women who used to hide people in their homes at night. There were women in the borders of this country who used to walk people across, going to Botswana at night. And there were women in this country who used to really hide people and pretend that they are mourning. There are stories of many women. So I see these awards as thinking of those things that other women were doing. People will never know about them. And I'm glad that I represent not just myself, but also those people.
You are also known for your passion in gender upliftment. And when you received the award, you told the president that the women of the world need recognition. Why do you feel strongly about that?
I feel strongly about women because I'm a woman too. But when I grew up in my own home, in my own village, Kokwana, I had an early contact very strongly with women because my mother belonged to a group that was called Zenzele. These were women who used to come to my home and would learn basic things now that seem very unimportant, how to knit, and they took care of their gardens, how to do crochet work, how to sew clothes, I'm always shocked that there are women who have never seen a sewing machine. I'm always shocked, even when I go home today, that there are people who can't even sew a basic hem or to shorten a skirt or a thing. And so those were the days. And so women were around our home, and there were many women when I grew up who would be in the village without their husbands. And one of the early things I started to do, being asked to do, were to write letters to many women who hadn't had the opportunity to go to school, to their husbands. And I remember Mama, my mother, saying, "Danam, never tell anybody about these things that you write about." And so I was feeling I'm so important, and I have all these secrets. But I wasn't thinking of gender. I wasn't thinking of women, why they are all on their own, and the women are all in the mines. But they were the people who were there all the time fetching water. That's the environment. They are the ones who are hoeing the fields. That's the environment I grew up in. And in later years, I was very lucky and very fortunate that I got a job. Not as a job, because I had qualified as a social worker after I had qualified as a teacher before then. And then this job said, the people says to me, "You will be working with women." And my passion, and I consider it my fortune, that it was a combination of a job I liked doing and a job working with women. And that's my background, that's where I come from.
You are also respected for the smooth management of the electoral system in the country when you were IEC chair. Can you tell us about the work that you've done now around the continent in helping other countries to achieve free and fair elections?
You know, we were very fortunate in South Africa that we organized elections so very late, in spite of the fact that we were suffering for so many years under the yoke of apartheid and under the yoke of colonialism. At the end, you know, the good Lord came through us at a time when we could do things. But prior to that, I must mention the fact that when I was working overseas, I worked for an organization called World Council of Churches. This was an organization where we worked all over the world, and I'm not exaggerating. All over the world, you travel where there are member churches of the world. And so I traveled through this job, and traveled mostly for women. And in the later years, after 1969, most countries I went to, most of the countries I went to, I partly worked with people forming anti-apartheid groups. So my own understanding and appreciation of other people in the world arose from that very strong. And the work that the World Council of Churches was doing in other countries where there would be crises of refugees and floods, we would be sent to these countries. And so by the time I was home, returning home, it was a time when Tambo had said to us, we must remember that we are representatives of South Africa, that in the world, and he would say that to me many times, that I do not speak for the African National Congress, I should speak for the oppressed people of South Africa. And so we returned home, and there was this very strong support, passion from the presidents at that time, and it is still so even today, of working with other countries in the continent and supporting them. And so we found ourselves, though we're latecomers, with the technology on our side, having to go to these countries and send teams, you know, oh, South Africans are wonderful people. They would go to these countries, the teams, and I would be so proud of the men and women of this nation with their work ethic and with their values of respect to the people we're working with, and also with their honor, really, that they were also returning to many people what we had received from them. And so we went to these countries. We liked doing it. Sometimes the conditions were very difficult. I remember when we were doing the Congo, and the colleagues would tell me that there were snakes in the places where they were sleeping. And some of these wonderful South Africans grew up in townships. They'd never been in rooms with snakes. And so and it was that challenge. And then in the later years, the African Union asked me to join a very interesting committee with a very prestigious name. We were called Panel of the Wise, and I was part of this team. So we were all over the continent supporting, not only observing, but also pre-election advice to other countries and conversations and sharing experience, and encourage them to look at models of other countries, you know, in the continent. And it has been a very fulfilling job that we did with also very committed people in supporting others.
That was Ubuntu Lifetime Achievement in Diplomacy Award recipient Dr. Brigalia Bam in conversation with Polity.